We have arranged this session in a very particular way as we want to to create a dialogue between the different case studies that we will present later on. But before we delve into this empirical contribution, I just want to briefly let you know what this group is actually about. And I also want to outline the wider context of our project to situate our discussion in this framework. So all of us who are presenting are part of or are affiliated with the Planetary Healing Group at LMU in Munich, which is a Reinhard Koselleck project funded by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. And we are currently in the process to conceptualize the notion of planetary healing based on fieldwork in various locations in the Americas, with an emphasis on Latin America. And we found that our work links very much up to the commons and commoning as practice and as a collective endeavor, which is, I think, a key notion in this context. I will now briefly outline our main concepts in order to sketch out the state of our thinking about planetary healing, and then we will move on to a critical discussion on commons and commoning in this context. So in our group, we take the devastations of the Anthropocene as starting point, and we refer to the subsequent damage as a planetary crisis. The concept of the planetary has obviously gained momentum in recent years, pointing to the impact of non-human forces and deep timescales. As anthropologists, we are interested to better understand how the planetary as events that happen on a large scale, such as storms or floods or earthquakes, affect our daily lives on the local level, and how this plays out quite unevenly in different wildlife worlds, as the literature on climate justice has convincingly shown. We also consider the diversity of cosmologies in shaping what is framed as the planetary, and seek to investigate how an abstract or heuristic term is translated into a lived experience. In order to achieve this goal, we explore scaling practices as a method. That is, we look into the ways people relate themselves to what we as scholars may call the planetary dimension. I just want to briefly mention here at this stage that the planetary discussion is actually already very tightly linked to commoning in the literature, and I point you to an article that was published in 2024 with the title "The Planetary Commons, a New Paradigm for Safeguarding Earth Regulation System in the Anthropocene." And I found this article quite interesting because its key point is to include the biosphere as a common and to exercise environmental stewardship on a much larger scale, that is, on a global scale. We as anthropologists don't work so much with these big and very far-reaching scales, but I just found this really interesting that concepts that we are very much familiar with also trigger into other disciplines. I briefly want now to comment on the notion of healing and its potential relationship with the commons and commoning. So what does healing in a planetary context actually mean? We conceive of healing as a concept that has the potential for socio-ecological transformation beyond the local or individual level. That is, healing is inherently transformative and may reconfigure human-environmental relationship. In other words, to achieve healing, something must change. Be that a structural change, be that achieving reconciliation or environmental justice, be that something that is related to spirituality, cosmology, or whatever. Healing further connects different yet contingent scale and is highly relational, as I already pointed out. And as an example, if people relate a storm to climate change is one thing, but they also may relate it to social wrongdoing, to social transgression, which would point to another scale. And these different scaling processes are very often interlinked and influence each other. So scales are by no means static, but dynamic and contingent. And healing is a practice that we would situate into these processes. Healing further has a specific temporality and a potential for future making. And in particular, the future is something that we would address quite prominently in our empirical material. And this finds expression in certain practices, be that storytelling, be that negotiating new interaction patterns or responsibilities between human and non-human assemblages. So we will now see how commoning is related to these dimensions that I just outlined and draw on our 4 case studies. We will include into the notions of commoning both material and immaterial goods that can generate healing effects, such as recognition of customary or collective rights and spiritual and physical well-being alike. We show, however, that in the process of commoning, inequality may be reproduced, for instance, as access to specific resources may be gendered or generational. We also ask if there are limitations to commoning and if commoning and capitalism are always in tensions to one another. To discuss this case study now amongst us. That would be the idea. So we get an idea how they kind of speak to one another. And I would like to open this discussion with my very first question, which is very basic but very central. What are the commons? What are the commons in your individual research examples? Who is included? Who is excluded from the commons?
So the first thing that appears as a commons in my research is, of course, nature, which is the very debated topic in the commons. And what I find interesting there is that nature, at least how with the rights of nature is conceived in Ecuador, is not as seen as a resource, but also how it is a shared responsibility, right? Because it's not how we profit from nature, but also who gets to defend it, who gets to say something about its healing, its restoration. So this is another idea of common nature. And then, of course, the knowledge that is conceived here to think of nature and to restore nature, and the different layers from societies or sectors of societies that are acting here, because and ancestral and local knowledges are usually not part of the national discussion. But I think with this new framework of the rights of nature, it's taking a new role, and its recognition is maybe commoning knowledge in this sense. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think it's a very important example because the rights of nature are kind of not so prominent and famous and gain more relevance globally, I would say. And Ecuador always figures as the most prominent example besides Bolivia, I would say. And looking at your case study, we encounter I would say the challenges that are inherent in that, and that it's not so easy to speak for nature as maybe some activist group would like to see it because of the knowledge practices involved and also because of the question of commoning. What is the common good that is actually to share also in terms of epistemic knowledge, so to speak, about nature? Okay, then we move on to our next question. In what ways does healing as commoning speak to colonial condition? And I think this is a question that is quite prominent in Meret Haack's presentation. So maybe you want to start.
Yeah, thank you. In my case, I think colonial conditions most clearly come into play in the discourse around the meaning of the law and what it means for different people, and about the discourse about the access to the sea. So I think there are 3 points important here. The first one As I mentioned, these MPOs in one line of argument represent a territorial transformation toward a communally managed sea and coastline. So in this context, we can see, or we can say, that it's an alternative vision of the sea, that in discourse is seen as opposed to privatization and extractivism, which instead is often associated with a continuation of a colonial logic of territories. And very closely linked to that, the second point. So the discourse often contains quite degrading campaigns against the law, stating, for instance, that MPOs would obstruct economic development. So in other words, in the discourse, there is still very often this image of abundance of resources that should be made use of for the sake of economic growth, and that there is no other way of relating to them or making use of them. And I think the third aspect, which is also important, refers to the history of the law and how different indigenous groups and communities advocated for the recognition of the customary uses in decades of mobilization, because they have been excluded from marine legislation before.
Thank you very much for answering this question. I would like to move on to one final one so that we kind of include everybody as well. And this question, I think, comes up very strongly in the talk of Markos Panayiotou. What challenges and tensions are involved in commoning, and can it go wrong, so to speak? Can it fail? I think it's a great example to address the tension between commoning and capitalism and commodification, which is always seen as in opposition to one another. So what is your take on this, Markos? Do you think commoning has failed in that regard? So healing powers are not for everybody, or you have to pay a high price for being healed? Or how is this seen on the local level in your project?
I also had, of course, this question in the course of this phase of my research, also always in the back of my mind. But I understood that local realities are always much more complex and ambivalent than that which one thinks, or than one's presuppositions, in the sense of what one perceives as a failure or as a negative implication is played out differently in the local context. So what I identified in the classical literature on the commons is that there's this tension between practices of sharing and reciprocity, which are often described as practices of the commons, and then their opposites, which are the practices of market exchange or capitalism. And also in the ethnographic literature on Amazonian communities, there's also this view that money somehow corrupts or negatively interferes with local healing or traditional systems. But in the case of my research, I've understood that money and monetary value systems seem to have merged and have been entangled with local healing practices and have also transformed them, and vice versa, that money has also been integrated into those systems and has also different meanings projected onto it, like the money having healing abilities, for instance. So I think it's more instructive to think of the transformation of these practices and the way they change through time by becoming entangled with different conditions.
Thank you. And I think your example very prominently also shows the capacity of ethnographic work by delving into the local context and getting a completely different view on what money could mean. You would have it at the first glance as a complete opposite of commoning, but by understanding the local perception of money, you will see that it's actually compatible with that concept. And of course, this concept is dynamic, and other items, things, materialities, values are integrated in the healing process as such, which is already, I think, super interesting to understand.